They thought kicking him off the plane was the end of it, just another policy in action. But when the doors opened in New York, the whole world was watching, and their worst nightmare was waiting at the gate. What happened next left a trail of shattered pride and viral headlines. But let's rewind to where it all began. Keanu Davis stepped onto the red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, ready for a quiet night. At 32, the black entrepreneur had become a regular in first class, though tonight he wasn't flexing it. He wore gray sweats and a red baseball cap pulled low, blending in like any other tired traveler. First class wasn't luxury for him anymore. It was time to recharge while managing his booming logistics company, Davis Direct. As he settled into seat 1A, sipping a small glass of whiskey and scrolling through spreadsheets, Keanu felt a faint shift in the air. Trouble had boarded this flight too, wrapped up in a crisp uniform and a peroxide blonde bob. Her name tag read Chelsea, but the way she carried herself screamed more like authority complex. "Excuse me, sir," Chelsea said, her smile just a touch too tight. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Keanu raised an eyebrow and held up his ticket with a calm confidence. "Pretty sure. Seat 1A. Unless tonight's a special night and you're bumping me up to pilot?" The passenger in 1B chuckled under his breath, but Chelsea's smile froze. She glanced at his ticket, then back at him. Something flickered in her eyes. Hesitation, maybe frustration, but she masked it quickly. "I'll just double-check," she said, taking his ticket and walking off with an air of forced politeness. Keanu sighed, leaning back in his seat. He'd been here before, the lingering stares, the not-so-subtle doubt. He didn't need to fight every battle, but something about Chelsea's energy told him this wasn't over. When she returned, his ticket in hand, she didn't apologize or even address the obvious. Instead, she lingered nearby, pretending to check the cabin but keeping him in her line of sight. Every time he moved, whether adjusting his seat or taking another sip of his drink, her eyes followed like a hawk watching prey. At cruising altitude, Keanu tried to focus on his tablet, but the pressure was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the uncomfortable silence in the cabin, it was Chelsea. She was hovering, waiting, looking for an excuse. And then she found one. Clipboard in hand, Chelsea approached with a stiff professionalism that didn't quite mask her suspicion. "Sir, I need to ask you to move to economy. It seems there's been a mix-up with your booking." Keanu blinked, caught between disbelief and amusement. "A mix-up? You mean the one where I paid for this seat and sat in it?" Her expression didn't flinch. "We have policies, sir. I'll need you to cooperate." The cabin had gone dead silent. Nearby passengers stopped pretending not to watch, their gazes darting between Chelsea and Keanu like spectators at a tennis match. Keanu felt a cold knot in his stomach. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper, a familiar weight, but he kept his voice calm. "Policies, huh?" he said, slowly standing to meet her gaze. "Mind pointing out which one says I don't belong here?" Chelsea hesitated. For the first time, her confidence cracked, though she quickly covered it with a dismissive scoff. "If you won't comply, I'll have to escalate this." Keanu took a deep breath and sat back down, tilting his head slightly. "Do what you gotta do," he said, voice steady. Chelsea turned sharply and marched toward the cockpit, her steps brisk and deliberate. Keanu watched her go, exhaling as he glanced out the window. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a butter knife. Passengers whispered among themselves, some sympathetic, others avoiding eye contact like the conflict might spread to them. Keanu adjusted his cap, his fingers gripping the armrests. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, bracing for whatever came next. This wasn't going to end quietly. By the time the plane landed for an unscheduled stop in Denver, Keanu Davis was no longer sitting in 1A. He wasn't sitting anywhere on that plane. Instead, he was in the terminal, pacing near Gate 12, his phone lighting up like a pinball machine. The disruption, Chelsea had reported to the captain, boiled down to one thing: Keanu calmly refusing to move from the seat he'd paid for. Apparently, that was enough to ground the entire flight. Keanu wasn't yelling. He wasn't pacing out of frustration. This was focus. His phone buzzed with calls from his assistant, texts from his legal team, and a growing flood of messages as news of the incident started spreading. "Keanu, man, they pulled you off for what?" His assistant's voice was sharp, buzzing through the receiver like static. Exactly what you're thinking, Keanu said, keeping his tone measured, calm, polite, and apparently disruptive enough to stop an entire plane. But Keanu wasn't rattled. He had backup. Somewhere in the crowd of passengers, a bold soul had pulled out their phone and started recording as Chelsea's voice climbed an octave, accusing him of violating policies she couldn't actually name. That video now sat on Keanu's phone, an ironclad receipt for what really happened. Meanwhile, across the terminal, Chelsea was having a different kind of evening. She walked with her chin high, her smile tight and satisfied. To her, this was a victory, order restored. The whispers and side eyes from passengers didn't faze her. If anything, they seemed to fuel her sense of authority. Laughing with her colleagues, Chelsea waved off questions like they were mere turbulence. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, smirking. "People think rules don't apply to them." The irony was thicker than the airport coffee, but Chelsea didn't seem to notice. Back on the plane, Keanu's absence was impossible to ignore. The tension that had lingered in the cabin earlier was now a full-blown fog. Conversation started in hushed whispers, but grew louder as time passed. Can you believe they pulled him off? That was uncomfortable. They really stopped the whole flight for that? In 1C, Emily Harper, a freelance journalist with a sharp eye for injustice, decided she'd had enough. She pulled out her phone, typed out a quick tweet, and attached the video another passenger had sent her. "Flight attendant kicks black passenger out of first class despite valid ticket. We need to talk about this. #racism in the air." It didn't take long for the tweet to gain traction. Emily's follower count wasn't massive, but the hashtags were. Within minutes, replies and retweets flooded in, with comments ranging from outrage to solidarity. Are we still doing this in 2025? Disgusting behavior. Airlines need accountability. Video proof or it didn't happen. The video was uploaded soon after, silencing any skeptics. Chelsea's sharp tone and Keanu's calm responses were on full display for the world to see. By the time Keanu returned from grabbing a coffee, his assistant's call had gone from panicked to ecstatic. "Boss, you're the top story on Twitter. Everyone's talking about it. Racism in the air is trending." Keanu paused, his coffee halfway to his lips. "That quick, huh?" His assistant didn't miss a beat. "People are eating this up. It's everywhere. News outlets are picking it up now. What's the plan?" Keanu let out a low, dry chuckle. "The plan? Let them run with it. Let's see how they handle turbulence when they're the ones under pressure." He wasn't smiling for show. This was personal, and this time he wasn't letting it slide. The plane touched down in New York under an unusually heavy cloud of tension. For most passengers, it was just another long flight with a few bumps along the way. But for Chelsea, it was the moment she realized those bumps were about to become a full-blown crash landing. Keanu Davis was waiting for them at the gate, standing tall with his legal team on one side and a crowd of supporters on the other. The energy in the terminal was electric. Journalists were packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing like strobe lights. A growing sea of onlookers had gathered, their phones held high, recording every second. The first passengers trickled off the plane, most keeping their heads down and hustling past the chaos. A few exchanged glances with Keanu, quick, apologetic nods that said everything they hadn't during the flight. And then came Chelsea, striding down the gangway with the kind of confidence that screamed denial. Her blazer was still crisp, her hair perfectly styled, but there was a noticeable twitch in her step. As her eyes scanned the scene ahead, they landed on Keanu at the center of it all, arms crossed and gaze steady. Her expression faltered for just a second, but that was all it took. The weight of what was happening hit her square in the chest. The passenger she had removed, the one she'd belittled in front of an entire plane, wasn't just anybody. "Miss Chelsea," Keanu said, his voice cutting through the buzz of reporters like a knife. It was calm but carried enough force to stop her in her tracks. "You remember me?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. For a moment, she seemed to shrink under the weight of 100 lenses, all aimed at her. Keanu stepped forward, his posture commanding, but not aggressive. "I believe you owe me an apology," he continued, his tone firm but measured. I didn't know," Chelsea stammered, her voice barely audible. Keanu's eyebrow arched. "Didn't know what? That I paid for my seat? Or that the person you targeted happens to own this airline?" The crowd rippled with murmurs, the journalists leaning in closer. Chelsea's face flushed crimson as her eyes darted to the cameras and back to Keanu. She opened her mouth, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. "I was just doing my job," she finally managed, though the words sounded hollow. "Your job," Keanu replied, his voice steady but sharp, "isn't to humiliate paying customers, and it's definitely not to abuse your power because of your own biases." The murmurs grew louder. Some in the crowd clapped, others gasped as the revelation unfolded in real time. Chelsea's polished composure was unraveling before their eyes. She shifted her weight, glancing around as if searching for an exit, but there was none. The story was already out, the video already viral. Her name was plastered across headlines. Keanu didn't press further, he didn't need to. The truth was doing all the heavy lifting. Chelsea's expression said it all: realization, panic, and a faint flicker of regret, though it was hard to tell if it was for her actions or the consequences. As she turned and hurried away, Keanu turned to the crowd, his voice carrying over the chatter. "This isn't just about me," he said, his tone firm but full of conviction. "It's about everyone who's ever been judged, mistreated, or denied their dignity. This isn't just my story, it's ours." The applause started small but swelled quickly, a wave of support echoing through the terminal. Keanu's words hit home, not just for the people standing there, but for the millions watching online. As the crowd roared, Keanu allowed himself a small smile. But he didn't linger in the moment. He had bigger plans to focus on, and this was just the beginning. What would you have done in Keanu's place? Have you ever faced or heard of similar situations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. Don't forget to like and share the story to keep the conversation going. This story was created to shed light on an important issue and spark meaningful change. Together, we can work towards a world where fairness and respect prevail. Your voice has the power to make a difference.